Okay, so I'm just going to try to quickly go through the game files that I have specifically, just try to go over anything interesting that's going on there. So kind of going through them in this list. So the bomb switch that I had, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. Essentially, we have a bomb switch manager that'll get called. We create 3 different graphic objects, one for an active switch, an inactive, active, and then the base of the switch itself. We go ahead and add the switch to our list, keep track of how many inactive switches we have. We also have a function to display the bomb HUD. This is basically just a quick little HUD just to indicate how many switches we have left to activate. And then whenever we have a switch that's activated, we call back to the bomb switcher. And if the number of inactive switches is less than 0, then we go ahead and initialize our goal text and continue from there. Activate our teleporter. Bomb switch, pretty straightforward. When we go ahead and create that, we'll check for the collision with the player. And if the player does touch it, then we'll set its active to true, change its graphic object. Pretty straightforward. The cameras, we kind of have 2 different cameras. There's kind of like a God cam that we have, as well as our title screen camera. This is used on the title screen itself. Just kind of positioning the camera, moving it around the planets in there. Now, this is one of the objects that I made. So I have a collision box. Basically, it's just an empty collision box that we can go ahead and set the scale, rotation, and position. So basically how the collision box works, we set it in, and then once the player goes ahead and collides with it, we'll also pass in a game event object. And whatever is inside of that game event object, we'll go ahead and trigger it. So I had a couple different game events that we used here. So as an example, show the teleporter event. I think this was called in one of our first scenes. Basically, when this gets called, we have an indicator. We go ahead and display a HUD indicating the roamers are guarding a teleporter, and that we want to kill them to activate it. We also activate the roamer manager's display number of tanks to show how many roamers are left on screen. So that's one of the events. We also similarly have another one to indicate the enemy has indicating the switches that we need to go ahead and activate, and displaying the HUD for that. The enemies themselves, so we were looking at the mothership and the FSM. So both of them are using, the roamer and the mothership, excuse me. So basically the mothership manager, pretty straightforward. We just create our mothership object. The mothership HUD essentially kind of creates a health bar object based on the health value of the mothership. Whenever the health changes, we'll go ahead and call this function. We'll determine how big the red bar should be relative to its original size, and kind of shrink that down to make that work with the health bar. And then the mothership itself basically kind of moves around every frame, essentially every frame when we get its current state. It's always going to be tracking the player. It's always going to be rotating towards the player position. We kind of figure out the cross product of its forward vector and its vector from its position to the player, and always rotates it towards the player itself. We have the alarms to switch between going from invincible to invincible to non-invincible, and switching off its shield to do that. So basically, there are kind of 2 different states where one, it just kind of shoots towards the player. It's always going to be shooting at the player with the different alarms. And then when it moves towards the player, we'll track the player. And as long as the distance from the player is greater than a certain amount, we will move forward. And then our roamer, the roamer basically kind of has 2 different states here. So similarly, the roamer will also call this function to track the player and rotate towards it and move towards it. So the roamer has two different states going in here that we're currently using. So its static state, essentially, it's just going to be kind of sitting there, not really doing anything. But if we'll always be checking to see if the player comes in range, and if it does, we'll start tracking the player. We'll submit an alarm for the firing of the bullets, and then when we track the player, we go ahead and call that track player function, essentially. Let's see, anything kind of interesting here? So the roamer factory is called whenever we just want to create the roamers whenever we need them. The roamer manager is called, we'll call that whenever we want to keep track of how many roamers are left on screen, so that whenever the roamers themselves, when all of them do get destroyed, we'll call an alarm and trigger a certain event depending on what happens there. We have a bunch of different HUDs that are going through here, essentially kind of the similar things. An invisible wall is implemented a couple places, kind of like the collision box. It's just an invisible plane, kind of preventing, it's kind of designed to prevent the player from going in any kind of specific direction. So it'll check for the collision with the player. It basically adds a push force, a forward vector onto the player's direction. So if the player tries to move against it, it won't be able to go through it. The key manager, so whenever we create a key, we'll create a new key, pass in its graphic object and its position, as well as a key door, we pass in its door and lock graphic object and that position as well. So that essentially whenever we pick up the key, we have a link to the door, and we call that door to just submit an exit. The planets, we have a list of all the planets that we're going to be holding on to, so that we can go ahead and use these on the title screen that are displayed there and also in the other scenes as well. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. We just pass in some data like the rotation data and some other things there. Let's see, the player. Player is pretty straightforward. We go ahead and have two different functions. It kind of has a camera FSM that we can pass in. It's either going to be following the tank, or it'll go ahead and follow the boss specifically. So those two different states here, we essentially just call that directly. Let's see. I think that's kind of the most interesting things that we have here right now. Yeah, so that's that's basically kind of the basics for the game that we've got then.